Welcome back to Trending in Education. Brandon Jones, Mike Palmer, and myself, Dan Strafford. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about screen time, a recent New York Times article about the socioeconomic divide around screen time in classrooms and at home. But as always, want to start off the show by bringing in Mike and Brandon. Brandon, how was your Thanksgiving break? Good turkey, good food. How is it to be back here on the podcast?
There's a lot of questions in there, Dan. It was good, as was the turkey, as was the food, including the turkey and the rest of the food. And I'm happy to be back. Yeah, I as I said before, I love Thanksgiving. Was back in OHIO for Thanksgiving with the fam. And it was good, but glad to be back.
A big win by the Ohio State University over the weekend.
Yeah, that's what this episode is about. Isn't that right? I have a friend who is a big Michigan fan. I guess we shouldn't throw shade at the people from Michigan who listen to our show. Keep listening.
Yeah, hail to the conquering heroes, right?
Yeah. But I offered to buy him some khaki pants as to commemorate Jim Harbaugh's probably eventual departure.
Wow.
Anyway, I went deep on sports. Life is good.
Yeah.
Glad to be back. Thanks for asking, Dan.
Mike, how about yourself?
I had a great break. I was being more, I became more aware of my use of screens over the last few weeks, few months, and I was somewhat conscious of that. Well, I was also just somewhat conscious at different points during my break as well. Tryptophan is a heck of a drug, but and football and parades. Watching a parade can
any dog show? How about the dog show?
Oh, the dog show is delightful.
So good.
It's a nice palate cleanser.
Yeah,
if you will.
That's nice.
But yeah, I am an iPhone user,
right?
And I have noticed that they are now pushing out more updates about my screen time usage, and always taking I take every break as an opportunity to prepare for my next podcast. So I did spend a little bit of time over the break just thinking about my own use of screens and how it's pretty pervasive. And it is also interesting when you start to track anything, you can then begin to get control over your behavior. So I did notice that since my iPhone has been tracking my screen time is coming down.
Yep.
But it's coming down from some astronomically large numbers.
Right.
So I don't have a lot to brag about.
You got to start somewhere, right? Yeah. So I actually, my cell phone broke back on Halloween, and I've been using a backup phone, but it is an iPhone. I'm an Android user, so I've noticed that I've used it less just because I'm not as good at using it. So it's become a nice break for me, not being on my phone as much as I have been. But Mike, we're talking about really a conversation spurred by a recent article in the New York Times about the socioeconomic divide in technology, both at home, but more so focusing on learning in the classroom, learning at home as well, and how studies have started to show that what I'll call here the well-off, the Silicon Valley example is relevant here. They're using less and less screen times, whereas districts that may have lower income into their schools, or lower income families are seeing more and more screen time. That's a brief synopsis, but your take on this article and how it sort of kicks off this conversation here for us to talk about screen time again on Trending in Education.
Yeah, sure. And article in New York Times back at the end of October by Nellie Bowles is the name of the reporter. And I think she did a really nice job summarizing the surprising divergence that's happening here. So I do think it is interesting to think about technology and access to technology as inverting in some places, which I think was the main thrust of this article, which is that traditionally, there's even a quote from Chris Anderson saying, like, the digital divide was about access to technology, and now that everyone has access, the new digital divide is limiting access to that technology. So screens, which for a while folks were saying that there's this gap between the developed and the developing world, and based on your socioeconomic status, you may not have access to screens, you may not have access to the internet, and there's going to be this growing divide where the elites have access to technology and the underclass will be deprived of that access. in many ways, it's flipping now, where the access is pervasive. Everyone has access to smartphones, has access to the internet, and the new and emerging gap is that more affluent parents are understanding some of the risks around screen time. Maybe they're getting their screen time updates from their Apple iPhones, and now they're thinking, I don't want my kids growing up around that much screen time. And it seemed even less about what school districts are doing or what the K-12 or pre-K educational systems are doing. And it's more about what parents are opting into, including private schools that maybe emphasize more like the offline aspects of learning. It's a topic we've covered in a few different ways on the show, but I thought it was really interesting to understand that flipping of the expectations around access. And we'll come back to it a little bit later on, but like I do think it has some analogies, interesting analogies can be drawn to like junk food and delayed gratification and some of the things that are really harder to develop in learners over their lives. So I thought it was a really interesting topic for us to dig into.
And it's been one we've touched on a few different times in varying degrees here on the podcast. We had Nicholas Tampio on to talk about screen time and his article. We've had some teachers on in the past. Brandon, from your viewpoint, a high level, and then we'll dive into some of those points Mike just made, this article specifically, or takes here on what it seems like a very relevant topic at this stage in the timeline of education and technology, that it does seem to be a divergent path for those with wealth and those without when it comes to digital screens.
Yeah, I think I may have a hard time sounding intelligible on this one because I don't know that I know what I think. So I'll give just some takes that they may be various degrees of warm and they may be various degrees of coherent or cohesive. But
can I make a quick suggestion?
Yeah.
Could you put your iPhone down?
Never. So about the article, because you asked about that, I think the article is interesting. And I think that it's objectively interesting to think about how, the trend and counter trend that we've talked about that dynamic a lot. And the trend, is pouring more money in the form of devices into classrooms and thinking that that's going to solve this digital divide as we've understood it, as Mike, you were just talking through in the article. The counter to that trend being parents and parents of means who are saying, no, actually, we're not sure what all this technology does to our kids. And, I think the article talks about this being, great social experiment that we're running, or not so great social experiment that we're running on our children. So I don't think I was aware that I was certainly aware of the trend. I wasn't as aware of the counter trend. So the article was interesting to me as just a person of the world and as a parent. I think that it may be that it's just better to be a person of means, right? Like people of means get to think about things, right? Get to think about like what's the best thing for their child and get to have coalitions with other parents where they're getting together monthly and say, what kind of technology should we expose our children to, and get to decide of the many things on this is a Christmas list that was being cited in here with Wii and Switch and PS4, and like which of those things they won't buy because they can buy other great gifts that express it. Like it's just better to be a person of means.
Right.
So I think that the conceit here, and this is where I'm admittedly meandering a little bit, but it's because I'm not sure what the right read is even for me as a parent. The conceit is that it is worse to have these devices than not for these children of parents of means. For the children in low socioeconomic status, underperforming schools, would it be better to pull those devices out of those schools? I'm not sure that it actually would. So I think we got some apples and like really, really, really fancy apples that we're comparing here. And I'm not sure. And if I can just continue on this jag for one moment, as a parent, I do think there is, I value screen time for my child, and I'm not doing it unwittingly or wantonly and just, saying to the devil may care how much time she's on a screen. But I'm also not a teetotaler, is the word they used here. I'm not a rejector of screen time.
You're not a neo-Luddite.
Right, I'm not a neo-Luddite. Does that make me a worse parent? I mean, I'm actively not thinking so in as so far as I'm making that decision every day.
Right.
But who knows? I think we are living in a great social experiment in lots of different ways. Technology is one major way in which that is manifested, and screen time is a particular way for the technology.
Right.
But I don't know.
Right. That was well articulated ambivalence and confusion.
Thanks, man.
Yeah,
I mean, I've thought about this a lot.
Yeah.
And in preparation for this episode, but also just as a parent of a 4-year-old,
Right.
I've had 4 years to be thinking about this. I feel for me anyway, and maybe it's that I'm not thinking about it the right way, or I may not be a perfect actor in this, but like it's just there aren't real clear answers for me personally.
I think that's right, and I think it's also interesting to think about it from like the real time context of when you might make a choice to give a screen to a kid,
right,
or get fast food for dinner, because I really like that analogy where like there are times when that's smart because you're ultimately freeing up other time to do other things. And it's all like a trade-off where like, what do I do with the time that I have? And when I provide access to a screen, that may be a bit of a shortcut in some places where I could be, sitting down and working on a puzzle with my child, but instead I'm now able to do other things. My child's getting access to different types of information and content that she wouldn't have had access to otherwise. It's maybe understanding that it is a choice, and that when you're making that choice, there are negative ramifications as much as there are positive ones. That's why, like, I think your take is, I think it's probably the right one. The interesting thing is like how all the founders of Silicon Valley are making the alternative choice, which is certainly troubling in its own right.
Yeah, and just 10 years ago, all the money that was going into schools, we talked about the Mark Zuckerberg donation to the New York City schools.
Mm-hmm.
It's all going to that one. I think maybe wasn't so good, but a lot of it was going for devices. And,
for sure.
Now that the guys and gals who are behind all of that tech are saying, but not for my kids.
Right.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, will they adopt it themselves? There has to be some skepticism in my brain, at least, of, well, is it not, if it's not good enough for your kid, why is it good enough for mine as I move forward? With 3 kids myself, 2 old enough to really use screens, and the youngest who is very into the screen, right? She understands
coding right now. Your 15-month-old is writing some new apps, right? She's
getting it done. She loves that it keeps flipping every time she moves it, that the screen goes with her. But it is, to Brandon's point, it's something I've thought of as I won't know till they're older. I like in real time, it's really difficult to understand the influence that day over day a screen is having. What I do find intriguing is, Mike, what you said about what they're looking at obviously matters too, right? It's not just playing a game on that, playing a Candy Crush or something that has some skill to it, but maybe a math game or things that you want to push them towards. Coding, you just said, something we're pushing our oldest Nora towards to at least understand and know it's there. But I do struggle with how much is too much. Like, what's that number? Is there a finite number? Is each kid different? And Mike, you've talked about it before. I just fear they're not playing enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and there is play involved with the device, and there, especially when you're playing against somebody else or you're involving your sister, which she doesn't always do. But I fear that this is taking away from the creative play that we can get to sometimes, and that the screen time replaces that, and replaces the figuring things out. It's sort of, here, play with this, and then you go from there. Where else do you want to go in this conversation, Mike? Feel like there are multiple different paths we can go down. You talked about fast food a little bit. You also have a few more notes that I know you took down. What path do you want to go down next from a discussion point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think right in line with what you're describing there, there's some citation of retreats for kids where they're sent somewhere where their activities are all off of screens, and they don't have access to screens. I've heard more of this as a maybe a counter trend for adults too, like where like, you know, you put your phone in a lockbox and you can't get into the lockbox for a while. And who do we become when we have to revert back to that crazy life that we were living 10, 15 years ago? It is interesting, the tie to social emotional learning and empathy, where when you have access to devices that are really designed for you as an individual user, an individual learner, you're typically more in your own world, and it becomes very transactional for me as the center of my own universe to engage with this screen to get outputs. And that's very different from collaborative exercises and more empathic exercises where I'm in a group and I'm trying to understand what it feels like to be somebody else. You know, I think good screen-based education maybe can touch at that. But I even think about, you know, we did a show on gaming addiction, and this is really a corollary to that, where like I can find fulfillment, I can find whatever I individually need through screens, and sort of that fundamental assumption leads towards like some solipsism and narcissism and lack of empathy. So I think that's pretty interesting, and I think that's a lot of what that plus the idea that a lot of these platforms are based on advertising and other sort of monetization models that you probably don't want to expose your kids to. Those are the two things that struck me that we hadn't really gotten to yet.
It's a moment here. We've talked about influencers in the classroom too, that sort of get paid by these major companies to bring technology or a specific program into the classroom. I think a lot of it, Brandon, for me, comes down to the reasoning. Like, why are you handing this technology, whether an iPad or a Kindle or an iPhone, whatever it may be, to a child? And what are you asking them to do with it, right? Is it, hey, kid, stop bothering me, I need to watch the Yankees game? I've never said that. But, or is it, hey, you want to do extra math work? Here's a device that can help you while I, you know, fold laundry. That's
while the Yankees game happens to be on while I'm folding laundry.
Exactly. So it is. But would you agree with that premise that it really comes down to a more nuanced, maybe not haves and have not, but how the technology is used and at what rate, and all of these smaller, minute details that may not be covered in this article specifically?
Yeah, I think for sure that the purposefulness, thoughtfulness. This is what, Mike, what you're talking about. That you're actively making a decision when you're either choosing to hand your child or a child the device or not, and just being thoughtful about that, I think is absolutely right. What's hard for me, and maybe this is just we can't know right now what impact this is having on an individual child, a generation of children, et cetera, is what skills they're gaining that are not the longer term attention span, et cetera. Like if you're eating a bunch of real confectionery stuff, like maybe your teeth fall out, but maybe you also develop a way to handle high amounts of sugar in your diet. I know nothing about sugar or teeth or diets.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like there's definitely downside that I think we can imagine. And I think there's localized downside that we can definitely see. What the upside that we're not aware of, and what the downside of not exposing a child to that, at least in some amount, actually having a neo Luddite, and what the sort of social, impact of that is for that child. Like it's hard to know. But I think at the very least being thoughtful about it, which is why I hope my reaction is the right one, at least for me, is because I do try to think about it. So, we're watching a Patriots game on Sunday, and, there's Gronk who's breathing in oxygen, and I'm talking to my daughter about what that experience, like, what is he doing there? That to me, like, that's not a disengaged parenting with the screen, just like, don't bother me, kid moment. That's not materially different than doing a puzzle with my child. So I think that's again, it's a thoughtfulness, it's awareness, purpose, bringing purpose to how you're doing it. I think that's the most important, because we can't know. I think it's very, very difficult to know real time what the impact is on your child or children in general.
Yeah, I like where you're going too, like where even if it's in front of a screen, if you're not denying your child access to you, it's different when you use the screen as a surrogate for parenting, and you're really absent for long periods of time where your kid's just engaging in screens. That's more demonstrably dangerous. But like, if that's a trade-off, you do some cost benefit analysis when the kid's on her own doing her thing with the screen, you're aware of it, you're intentional about it, but then also spending time to kind of process what's coming through. And like we talked about, the greatest gift this holiday season is giving of our time.
We sure did.
It does seem relevant in this context where, like, by no means should we be starving our children of quality time with their parents, but that does tie back to the socioeconomic angle where, like, if you're spending the majority of your time working a second job to make sure your kids are fed and they have clothes on their backs and they have a nice home, considering your means, if they spend a little more time on their screens, that's a real life trade-off.
It's a real life trade-off. Yeah. I think that a takeaway, and again, this maybe not have been such an aha, but we talked about technology used poorly in the classroom. This is, I think, a way to shorthand this is an influx of devices into a classroom is not a panacea. It is not itself a way to address a divide in instructional quality, access, etc. It may be neither necessary nor sufficient, but I don't think it's necessarily bad. We just shouldn't say, "Oh yeah, we sent 1,000 iPads to a school in Newark, and so we're all set." Yeah. Like that seems to be not a great conclusion to come to, which this article reinforces. So just not just the thoughtfulness about what you're doing locally with your child, but like also just being thoughtful about what kind of experience different children are having, and what is helping to narrow the divide versus widen it. I think just thinking about that and thinking about the ramifications of stuff that we're doing, that's also just good as a person of the world.
There was a very intriguing story about preschool, fully digital preschool. I believe it was in Utah that was getting federal funding that was spreading as well. We won't know for a while what the ramifications of that are until these students become, high school and college students and see entrance exams and employment rates and all of those things much further down the line. Mike, as we wrap here, this is a topic we've hit on many times before. I'm sure we'll come back to many times in the future, simply because of its prevalence in education, in learning, but also just everyday life. Any final thoughts here on screen time, on this article specifically, and what you think could be next?
I just think delaying gratification is something that we all need to learn and teach ourselves and teach others. And it's increasingly getting hard when we have access to everything all the time. So my biggest takeaway, Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow experiment, where like how soon will you pop the marshmallow in your mouth versus wait for later to get more goodness, is a real challenge that we're all facing really throughout all of our lives all the time. And in some ways, our smartphones are virtual marshmallow dispensing devices. So I'd say just be careful how often you're feeding yourself.
I will admit my kids have many times over said, "Dad, why don't you just look it up?" when I don't know the answer to something. So we are in the thick of it, to say the least. We do our best to not eat too many marshmallows in this house as we go forward. Great conversation, one we will continue in the future here on Trending in Education. As always, we look for you to subscribe, like, and comment on this. This is at iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, across all your podcast apps. Also, find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed, and on Facebook as well, trendingineducation.com. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Trending in Education.